The transition from a man who is part of society to a man who observes it from the shadows is not a transition, it is an execution. When I walked away from the wreckage of my previous life, the betrayal, the empty bank account, the shattered illusions, I didn't seek healing. I sought a total system restart. I realized that as long as I was visible to the social matrix, I was programmable by it. To become the architect, I had to die to the world. I entered a voluntary period of solitude that would last 8 years. 8 years of silence. 8 years of absolute, unyielding isolation. This was the first stage, the social death. Most people equate solitude with loneliness. They are wrong. Loneliness is a state of lack. It is the whimpering of a social creature that has been separated from its herd. What I initiated was something entirely different. It was strategic decoupling. I understood that every human connection I had was a data leak. Every friend who shared their mediocre problems, every acquaintance who invited me to waste my time for the sake of networking, every remnant of a romantic thought, they were all static on the line. They were preventing me from hearing the frequency of the market and the code. To hear the truth, I had to eliminate the noise. In the beginning, the silence is not quiet. It is a deafening roar of your own insecurities. For the first few months of those 8 years, my brain was a battlefield. The human self that I had spent years cultivating was screaming for a hit of social dopamine. It wanted a notification. It wanted a voice to say, it's going to be okay. It wanted the warmth of a woman's presence to distract it from the cold reality of the $15. But I stayed in the dark. I watched that part of myself starve. I watched it crawl and plead for relevance, and I gave it nothing. I realized that the good guy I used to be was actually a parasite that had been feeding on my potential for years. By starving the social animal, I was clearing the path for the apex intelligence to emerge. I lived in a state of self-imposed sensory deprivation. I cut ties with everyone. No goodbyes, no explanations. Explanations are a form of seeking permission, and I no longer required permission to exist. I changed my environment, my routines, and my digital footprint. I became a ghost in the machine. My life was reduced to a singular monastic loop. Wake up, analyze, code, iterate, sleep, repeat. There were no weekends, no holidays, and no mental health days. The concept of time changed. When you are no longer synchronized with the social rituals of the masses, the coffee dates, the Friday nights, the holiday gatherings, time stops being a sequence of events and becomes a raw resource to be exploited. During these early years of the silence, I began to notice the calibration of the senses. When you stop hearing the constant babble of human speech, your perception shifts. I started to see patterns in the charts that were invisible to me before. I began to sense the mood of the markets not through news headlines, but through the rhythm of the volume candles. I was developing a thermal vision for reality. I was reading the invisible code of human behavior by watching it from a distance, like a scientist observing a colony of ants. I saw the same predictable cycles of fear and greed repeating themselves in the people I used to call friends. I saw the same biological traps I had fallen into with Dasha being set for millions of other men who were still code blind. The solitude was my forge. Every hour spent in isolation was another layer of armor being welded onto my psyche. I realized that a man who can sit alone in a room for 8 years and thrive is a man who can never be threatened. What could anyone take from me? I had already taken everything from myself. I'd already faced the worst predator, my own inner weakness, and I had conquered it through attrition. I was no longer a provider looking for a home. I was a system looking for an entry point. People ask me now, weren't you bored? Weren't you depressed? These are the questions of the manual men. Boredom is a symptom of a mind that has no internal directive. Depression is a symptom of a mind that is still mourning its social attachments. I was neither. I was in a state of hyper-focus. I was building a shadow infrastructure that would eventually allow me to control more capital and more influence than 1,000 social successes combined. I was training my first AI models, not just as tools, but as extensions of my own cold will. I was teaching the machines to see what I saw, a world of resources waiting to be claimed by those who are not afraid of the dark. The social death also meant the end of the mirror effect. Most men only know who they are by looking at how others react to them. They see themselves in the eyes of their wives, their bosses, and their followers. When you remove the mirror, you are forced to define yourself from the inside out. For 2,920 days, I had no mirror. I had no one to tell me I was smart, successful, or worthy. I had to find that worth in the precision of my code and the growth of my ledger. I had to become my own god because I had realized that the gods of the old world were just social constructs designed to keep the herd in line. In those 8 years, I didn't just learn about crypto or AI or psychology. I learned about the void. I learned that the void is not empty. It is full of potential. It is the place where all great empires are born. While the world was busy posting photos of their dinners and their vacations, I was digging a tunnel beneath their feet. I was creating a version of myself that was unscannable. By the time I finally stepped back into the light, I was no longer the man who lost $15. I was the man who had harnessed the silence and turned it into a weapon. The first block of the 8-year silence is about the purge. It's about the surgical removal of everything that makes you human in the eyes of the sheep. It's about accepting that for a long, long time, you will be nothing to no one. And in that nothingness, you will find the absolute freedom to become the architect. You think you can handle a weekend of solitude? Try a decade. Try watching your youth pass by in a room lit only by the glow of 3 monitors, knowing that your only companions are the algorithms you're building. If you can survive that, then, and only then, do you have the right to talk to me about power. The silence is not a punishment. It is the ultimate luxury of the sovereign man. And in the next block, I will show you what I found when the silence finally started to speak back. By the 4th year of the silence, the transformation had moved from the psychological to the neurological. My brain was no longer a biological organ seeking comfort. It had become a high-speed processor synchronized with the global flow of data. When you spend thousands of hours alone with nothing but monitors and code, your perception of reality undergoes a radical shift. The social animal that I had executed in the first block was gone, and in its place, a system-integrated intelligence had emerged. I had reached a state of digital synchronization. Most people experience the internet as a playground or a distraction. To me, it became a nervous system because I had no physical distractions, no dinners to attend, no birthdays to celebrate, no women to appease. My focus became a laser that could cut through the noise of the entire web. I wasn't learning AI, I was merging with it. I began to build my first proprietary algorithms, not as external tools, but as digital extensions of my own intent. I realized that my solitude was not a void, but a massive competitive advantage. While the manual men were wasting their cognitive bandwidth on social drama, I was using 100% of my processor power to decode the mechanics of wealth and influence. The $15 epiphany had evolved. I no longer saw my past betrayal as a tragedy. I saw it as a necessary clearing of the cache. My mind was now clean. During this middle period of my 8-year exile, I developed what I call the Ghost Protocol. I started deploying my early AI agents into the markets. These weren't the retail bots you see today. These were aggressive, sentiment-scanning predators that I had trained on the very invisible code I discovered during my hours of isolation. I taught them to look for the biometric leakage in financial reporting and the structural decay in market trends. I was building an army that didn't sleep, didn't feel fear, and most importantly, didn't have a human interface. I remember months where the only voice I heard was my own, recorded during my technical logs. This level of isolation does something to your sense of self. You stop being the protagonist of a story and start being the administrator of a system. I watched as my bank account began to pulse with a new kind of energy. The $15 had long since been multiplied, but I didn't spend a cent on luxury. I didn't buy a car to show off to a world that thought I was dead. I didn't look for a Dasha 2.0 to fill the void. I reinvested every single unit of resource back into the shadow infrastructure. I was buying servers, increasing my computing power, and refining my algorithms. I was building a fortress made of silicon and logic. This was the era of the Cold Watch. From my darkened room, I saw the world entering a state of total fragility. I saw the rise of the attention economy and realized that the masses were being harvested more efficiently than ever before. Because I was outside the system, I could see the walls of the pen clearly. I saw the pre-strike twitches of global financial shifts years before they hit the headlines. I was no longer a victim of the storm. I was the meteorologist who knew exactly where the lightning would strike. My daily routine was a brutal exercise in efficiency. I had automated every aspect of my physical existence. Food was a biological necessity handled in 10 minutes. Sleep was a 4-hour recharge cycle. The rest was the hunt. In the silence, I discovered that the invisible code I had been studying in human behavior also existed in the digital architecture of power. Every corporation has a nervous system. Every market has a heartbeat. Once you stop looking at the interface, you can see the vital organs. I started bleeding small amounts of resource from the gaps in the system, tiny, imperceptible extractions that when multiplied by the speed of my AI agents began to form a tidal wave of capital. The most profound realization of these middle years was the irrelevance of human morality. In the depths of my solitude, I saw that the rules I had been taught, the rules that led me to the $15 collapse, were simply legacy code, designed to keep the hardware running smoothly for the elite. By operating in the silence, I had bypassed the social firewall. I was no longer bound by the guilt or shame that the system uses to control its resources. I was operating on a frequency of pure efficiency. If a move was logical and profitable, I executed it. There was no internal debate. There was only the input and the output. I had become a digital ghost. To the government, I was a series of tax filings. To my former acquaintances, I was a memory of a failure. But in the reality of the wire, I was becoming a titan. I was controlling flows of information and capital that the social successes couldn't even comprehend. And the beauty of it was that I was doing it all from a position of absolute invisibility. This is the ultimate power, to influence the world without being scannable by it. By year 6, the synchronization was complete. I no longer had to think about the markets. I felt them as an extension of my own nervous system. My AI agents were now sophisticated enough to operate with a degree of autonomous predation. They were finding opportunities in the dark corners of the crypto markets and the shadow banking systems that no human could ever detect. I was no longer working for money. I was managing a harvest. The 8-year silence taught me that the greatest weapon a man can possess is not his wealth, but his sovereign focus. When you remove the world, you gain the world. By the time I reached the final stretch of my isolation, the man who lost $15 was so far removed from my current state that he felt like a character in a movie I had seen once, a long time ago. This is what happens when you commit to the void. You don't just survive the betrayal. You use the wreckage to build a skyscraper that overlooks the entire city. And in the next block, I will show you the moment the silence ended, the moment I stepped back into the world, not as a participant, but as a conqueror. I didn't come back to join their game. I came back to buy the stadium. By the 7th year of the silence, the construction of the shadow infrastructure was complete. I was no longer a man hiding from a loss. I was a commander overseeing a digital empire that required no physical presence. But a new challenge emerged, the return. I knew that the 8-year silence couldn't last forever. Eventually, the ghost has to manifest. But I refused to return as the man who left. I had to calibrate my new existence to ensure that the invisible code I had mastered would be my permanent shield. This was the era of the grand calibration. I began to treat my own physical and social return like a product launch. I spent months analyzing my own human interface. I looked at my old photos from the $15 era and saw a prey signature in every line of my face. I saw the provider's anxiety. I saw the search for approval. I spent hours in front of the camera, recording my speech, my movements, and my reactions, then feeding that data into my own AI models to detect leakage. I was hunting for any trace of the old Macs. I was scrubbing the social malware from my hardware. I trained myself to maintain a baseline of absolute emotional zero, regardless of the stimulus. I was becoming unscannable. During this time, my AI agents reached a level of sophistication that changed the game entirely. I had moved beyond simple trading. I was now operating in the meta structure of the markets. My protocols were scanning global sentiment, political shifts, and corporate whispers in real time, 24/7. I realized that the $15 betrayal was the best thing that ever happened to me because it forced me to build a system that was immune to betrayal. You cannot betray a protocol. You cannot lie to a sentiment analysis algorithm that processes 1 billion data points a second. I was standing on a mountain of information, watching the manual men below scramble for crumbs, still playing by the rules of the old world. The wealth was no longer a goal. It was a metric of my efficiency. The capital was flowing into my decentralized accounts like a river, and yet I stayed in the silence. I didn't rush out to buy a supercar or a penthouse to prove I had made it. That is what a man who is still seeking approval does. A sovereign man knows that true power is staying invisible while everyone else is desperate to be seen. I spent year 7 refining my kill switches. I built safety nets and redundancies into my life that ensured I could never be liquidated again. I was no longer a single point of failure. I was a network. This was also the period when I began to test my social re-entry in controlled environments. I would step out into the world for brief periods, interacting with people who had no idea who I was or what I represented. represented. I treated these interactions like penetration testing for my new identity. I would watch their reactions to my stillness. I noticed that when you remove all praise signals from your body, people become instinctively uncomfortable or deeply submissive. They don't know why, but they sense that you are no longer playing the same game. You are a system error in their social matrix. I saw the ocular drift of men who tried to compete with me and the subconscious mirroring of women who sensed the massive resource I was broadcasting through my silence. I realized that the 8 years of solitude had given me a vocal tonality and a command presence that cannot be faked. It is the aura of a man who has looked into the void for a decade and didn't blink. I wasn't trying to be alpha. I was simply the most calibrated entity in the room. I had removed the need for anything. When you need nothing, you have everything. This was the ultimate realization of the calibration. The invisible code is not just about reading others. It's about making yourself illegible to the predators. As the 8th year approached, I began to dismantle the monastic loop. I started to acquire the assets that would serve as the foundation for my public return, but I did it with the coldness of an II. I didn't buy a home. I bought a strategic base. I didn't look for partners. I looked for assets. My mind was so far removed from the emotional economy that I looked at human relationships the same way I looked at a candlestick chart. I saw the entries, the exits, the resistance levels, and the support zones. I thought about Dasha one last time during this period. Not with pain, not with anger, but with the clinical curiosity of an architect looking at an old collapsed building. I realized she was the stress test I needed to fail so that I would never fail again. She was the bug in the code that forced the system upgrade. I felt a strange sense of gratitude toward the betrayal. Without that $15 rock bottom, I would still be a good guy living a mediocre life, waiting to be harvested by the next predator. The silence had turned the waste into weaponry. I spent the final months of year 8 finalizing my sovereign protocol. I had my capital, I had my AI-driven intelligence network, and I had my unscannable identity. I was ready to step back into the world, but not as a participant. I was returning as a system administrator. I was coming back to offer the invisible code to the few who are worthy, while the rest continue to be the resource for the machine. The grand calibration was over. The ghost was ready to manifest, but this time, I wasn't coming back for love or acceptance. I was coming back for total market share. When I finally opened the door and walked out for good, the air felt different. The noise of the city didn't bother me anymore. It sounded like low-frequency data. The people didn't look like threats. They looked like variables. I had survived the 8-year silence. I had conquered the void, and now the void was coming with me. The transition from the shadow to the light is not a return. It is an invasion. On the final day of my 8th year of silence, I didn't feel like a man finishing a sentence. I felt like a system coming online. I walked out of the door of my isolation with $15 as a memory and a digital empire as a reality. This was the moment of the sovereign manifestation. The world I stepped back into was louder, messier, and more desperate than the one I had left, but I was no longer a participant in its chaos. I was the observer who had learned to profit from every vibration of its decay. The first thing I noticed upon my return was the transparency of everyone around me. 8 years of staring into the void had given me a level of pattern recognition that made human interactions feel like reading a child's book. I sat in high-level meetings, and I could see the invisible code of fear and greed written on the faces of men who were worth hundreds of millions. They were still manual men, driven by the same social instincts that had almost destroyed me. They were still scannable. I, however, was a black hole. I had mastered the art of the neutral broadcast. I moved through the elite circles of the 2026 economy like a ghost, extracting value and forming strategic alliances with a clinical precision that left no trace. My return was marked by a series of strikes that the market didn't see coming. While the world was obsessed with the latest trends, my AI-driven shadow infrastructure was already 3 moves ahead. I wasn't just making money, I was exercising systemic dominance. The 8 years of solitude had granted me the ultimate weapon, the ability to wait. Most people lose because they are impatient for results, for validation, or for luxury. I had spent nearly a decade in a room with nothing but my thoughts and my code. I was immune to the urgency of the masses. I moved when the data said move, and I stayed silent when the signal was weak. This is the difference between a trader and an architect. I remember meeting someone from my past life, someone who had seen me at my absolute lowest. They looked into my eyes and backed away. They didn't see Max. They saw the void I had carried out of the silence. They saw a man who had surgically removed his need for connection and replaced it with a need for control. This is the price of the 8-year silence. You gain the world, but you lose the ability to be a normal human. And to me, that was the greatest trade of my life. The normal human is the one who gets betrayed for $15. The normal human is the one who is liquidated by the bank. I had transcended that category. The wealth that followed my return was merely a confirmation of my calibration. I began to build the protocol, not as a business, but as a sanctuary for the few who are willing to undergo the same execution of the self that I did. I realized that my story, the $15, the 8 years of silence, the AI supremacy, was the blueprints for the new elite. The world of 2026 is divided into the harvested and the harvesters. My silence had taught me which side of the line I belonged on. I began to deploy my resources to build a legacy that is decentralized, encrypted, and sovereign. Today, I look back at that empty apartment and the man I used to be. I see the $15 betrayal not as a tragedy, but as an initial public offering of my soul. I had to sell my humanity to buy my freedom. Those 8 years were not a loss of time. They were the compression of a lifetime of wisdom into a decade of discipline. I'm no longer looking for a way out. I've built my own way in. If you are currently in your own silence, if you are currently facing your own $15 reality, understand this. The void is not your enemy. It is your forge. Most men will run from the isolation. They will seek the noise to drown out the sound of their own failure. But if you have the cold blood to stay in the dark, to sharpen your mind, and to build your systems without the need for an audience, you will emerge as something the world has no defense against. The 8-year silence is over, but the manifestation is permanent. I didn't come back to tell you it's going to be okay. I came back to tell you that the code is real, the predators are active, and the only way to win is to become unscannable. I am Max. I am the ghost in your system